You have probably heard about this concept of f8 and be there, or f11 and be there. And the idea behind this concept is quite simple, which is that you set your aperture to f8, so you don't really have to worry too much about focusing because everything will be in focus anyway. And usually you also combine it with manually focusing, let's say from 2 meters to infinity, and you basically have everything in focus without even having to bother about autofocusing at all. That sounds convenient, right? But in reality, it sucks. And in today's video, I want to share with you why I dislike f8 and be there, and why I think it's creatively very constraining. And stay tuned till the end because I'm going to tell you why f3.2 is actually my favorite aperture. So let's get into it. And the first reason why I think that f8 and be there is incredibly limiting is because you effectively give up control over the most creatively limiting setting of your camera. And in my opinion, the most important setting for most types of photography is aperture. And by sticking to f8 for all of your photography, you're basically throwing away all the creative opportunities that you have of any other f-stop. I mean, think about it. ISO is effectively just a technical gain applied to boost the signal of your sensor's data. Then you have shutter speed, and most of the time the goal of our photo is to have a crisp and sharp image. So we tend to just shoot at a shutter speed that's slow enough to freeze the action in your scene. And effectively it doesn't really matter whether we shoot at 1/200th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. But aperture substantially changes the way your photo looks because it controls depth of field, so how much is in focus. It also controls how well your subject is separated if desired, and it also controls how much light is actually hitting your sensor. And sure, sometimes having your aperture set to f8 is useful because it usually gives you everything in focus from foreground, midground, onto the background. But what, for instance, if you want to include a foreground element and have it slightly blurry, so enhancing the scene but not distracting from your main subject in the midground, for instance? Or what, for instance, if you want to make sure that the main emphasis of your photo is your subject and you just want to separate your subject from the background by choosing a lower f number like f2 or f2.5, for instance? And as mentioned previously, aperture also controls the amount of light that's hitting your sensor. And sometimes I want less light to reach the sensor, so I stop down to f16 because it means that I can shoot at slower shutter speeds. And slower shutter speeds mean that I can include motion blur to express a degree of movement. So in other words, by sticking to f8 and be there, you definitely make things easier, but you definitely also strip yourself from creative choices you can't really do anymore that might make the work you do truly yours. And by the way, if you're liking the video so far, then I would truly appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel, as it would help me to reach a wider audience and tell the YouTube algorithm that this video is actually alright. And now let's get to the second reason why I find f8 and be there relatively limiting, which is that you deprive your sensor of light. And we all know it that photography is, in essence, about light. And the more light reaches your sensor, the better your image is going to be, most of the time. But by shooting everything at f8, you reduce the hole of your aperture to a very, very small hole. And that means that very little light can actually hit your sensor. And that is not necessarily a problem if you shoot, for instance, with a crystal clear blue sky and the sun directly hitting the front glass element of your lens, then it probably doesn't matter. So recently, for instance, I've been shooting a lot in Amsterdam and Den Haag. If you've ever been to the Netherlands, you know that it tends to be quite grim even during the day because you have a cloudy, dark, overcast sky and you have a lot of rain. But if you shoot everything at f8 and be there, then you also make that aperture hole incredibly small. So there is limited light and you also only let in a fraction of that limited light, and the camera usually has to make up for the lack of light hitting the sensor by increasing the ISO. So had I, for instance, shot the photos that you see right now at f8, I would probably consistently shoot between ISO 1600 and ISO 6400, despite it being daylight. And now you might say, but Pitt, isn't your entire channel basically geared around this idea that gear doesn't matter and that technical image quality is overrated and that it doesn't really matter whether I shoot my photo at ISO 800 or at ISO 1600? And that is true, but this is actually a good transition into the next reason why f8 and BDIR is very limiting, which is that in many cases, you don't even need to stop down as far as f8. Consider this photo here, for instance, and it's obviously taken in Amsterdam, but more importantly, it's sharp from the foreground to the midground to the background. So the bikes in the foreground are sharp, the subject in the midground is sharp, and also your background is sharp. And guess what aperture I have taken to take this photo? In fact, I have photographed this photo at f3.2. Not f4, not f5.6, not f8, and definitely not f11. So how do I manage to take this photo at f3.2 in one single photo? And there is 4 aspects that define how much of your photo is actually in crisp focus. And the first aspect that affects how much is going to be in focus is your focal length. Because if you have a wide angle lens, like here for instance, this is taken on a 28mm lens, I'm not allowed to talk about it yet because it's still unreleased, but the wider your lens, the more automatically will be in focus at the same aperture. And since 28mm on full frame is a reasonably wide angle lens already, it also means that you have automatically more of your scene in focus. While on 50mm lenses and on 85mm lenses, you might really do have to stop down to f5.6 or f8, and your background might actually still be blurry. The next thing you need to understand is where to focus, because that's something I have slept on a little bit too much. I tended to intuitively just focus on the most important thing, my subject. But when I want to have everything in focus, I realized it's actually much more clever to selectively focus in order to have everything in focus. So in this photo here, for instance, I have decided to focus on this specific bike on the right-hand side. But the question is why? And had I focused on the foreground, then everything in the background would be blurry. Had I focused on the background, everything in the foreground would be blurry. But if I focus somewhere in the middle, I actually get everything from the foreground, the midground, and the background in focus at the same time. So next time you go out and shoot, don't just mindlessly focus on your subject, but focus on the space that will give you the depth of field that you desire. Also consider subject distance, because when your subject is super close to the camera, then automatically your background will be blurry. This is something you can easily just recreate with your phone by going close to an object and focus on that object. And as you go closer, you see how the background will become blurrier and blurrier, even on a tiny sensor like the one on your phone. And then finally, it also makes a difference as to what sensor size you're shooting on, because this photo here, for instance, is taken on an APS-C camera, but if you shoot on full frame, then you might have to stop down further to get the same amount of stuff in focus, because the bigger sensor will produce blurrier out of focus areas. But it really shows that it's not necessarily always a disadvantage to have a smaller sensor like APS-C, for instance. And then the final reason why f8 and BDIR is not necessarily something I like to use is because back in the days when f8 and BDIR was like totally hyped, there was good reasons why people used f8 and BDIR and zone focused on their scenes, simply because autofocusing performance back then were not very good, and you didn't want to rely on an unreliable autofocusing system. But these days we have fantastic cameras. The Sonys, the Canons, the Nikons, they just focus blindly. You don't even have to look. You know that they will find your face. Well, my Fuji is probably about to lose me just because I did this. But even my Fuji cameras are actually incredibly predictable to focus. I use single point autofocus 95% of the time. And I know that if I single point autofocus in the specific area I want to place the focus in, the focus won't move. Even in low contrast scenes, I know that no matter where I place my box, what's under the box will be in focus all the time. And since autofocusing has become so much more predictable over the years, zone focus is in most cases probably not really required anymore, especially the downsides that it gives you, making you lose creative control, depriving your sensor of light, and also having an excessively large depth of field, even though you could probably get away with something like 5.6 or f4. And finally, I promised you a bonus tip, which is that I tend to shoot at f3.2 as much as I can. And that has three main reasons. The first one is that I find it to look very natural. It's not like you completely throw your background out of focus. I mostly shoot on wide angle lenses like 28 or 35mm full frame equivalent focal length. And I just find that it gives me a slight emphasis on your subject, a slight blurriness in the foreground and a slight blurriness in the background. So I find that the look is very natural in my photos. And the second reason why I like f3.2 is because f3.2 gives me a lot of light. So it's slightly stopped down, but it's still letting in so much light that even in dull gray light, I will still be able to capture enough light to keep my ISOs nice and low. And the third and the final reason why I like to shoot f3.2 is because of optics. And most modern day optics are so good that they are excellent wide open, and you just have to stop them down a slight bit, like a stop or a stop and a half, in order to achieve maximum sharpness. So my lenses, for instance, open to f2 or f1.4, some of them, and by shooting at f3.2, I just stop them down a bit and I get maximum optical performance. I get basically no chromatic aberrations or fringings on contrasting edges, and I also remove the vignetting that can occur if you shoot wide open, making your corners very dark. And of course, today's video was not meant to hate on f8 and be there. It was mostly just to show you the limitations of that approach, but also to make you use aperture with more considerations in mind. And even though you might have fixed aperture, that does not necessarily fix your photos. And if you want to know 3 things that might be the reason why your photos look boring, then I highly recommend you check out this video up here. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hopefully see you in next week's video. Bye.